In late December of 2024, in Setagaya Ward, an upper-end part of Tokyo, a Lamborghini swerved off the road and crashed. Nobody was injured. The car was totaled, but otherwise, the damage that was done was limited to a tree and a street lamp. Now, the first thing you'd expect the driver to do would be to call the police. You just wrecked a car that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and caused some damage to public property. And the wreck needs to be cleared so it doesn't get in the way of others. You also need to inform the police of the accident so an official record of the incident is issued, which is necessary for claiming insurance. Lambos are pretty expensive, so they're insured for a lot of money, right? But instead of taking the sane, normal, and obvious course of action, the driver fled. Now remember, this is all taking place in Japan. Japanese people are known for rigidly following social norms, like giving up their seat on the train to the elderly, standing on the left side of the escalator when they're not in a hurry so that those who are can go up faster, and not considering having sex with prostitutes as cheating. Following the proper procedures when you've just been in an accident would be beyond question for any Japanese person. Except, well, this particular one. Now, who was this individual who fled the scene of the accident? His name is Koji Tanaka, more commonly known as Cozy. He is a 35-year-old kickboxer who has competed in K1 and Rizin. Now, it is unknown why Cozy decided to flee the scene of the accident. Perhaps he was concussed. We don't know what was going through his head at the time. However, the most plausible explanation for this behavior, as was said by many fans and even other Japanese fighters, was that Cozy had been driving under the influence. Of course, if Cozy had been driving under the influence, he'd be ineligible to claim insurance. He'd also likely be subject to a hefty fine and possibly face jail time. However, since he fled the scene of the accident, we will never know what truly happened. As of now, Cozy has had his driver's license revoked, but he has faced no jail time. Now, you might be wondering about why I just went on about a little accident that a 35-year-old semi-retired Japanese kickboxer caused, when, other fighters like Conor McGregor, Jon Jones, and countless others have done similar and far worse things. I mean, in Jon Jones's case, he injured a pregnant woman when he had his hit and run, right? If you're a combat sports fan, Cozy's case is nothing out of the ordinary. Hearing about a UFC fighter getting arrested for violent outbursts, drug offenses, DUIs, or any other number of crimes is something we hear just about every other week. But we must then ask ourselves, why is this nothing out of the ordinary? Why do so many fighters seem to engage in criminal activity? And if you're wondering why I use Cozy as an example, it was to demonstrate that this trend is not limited to the UFC. Even in Japan, a country which is known for having one of the lowest crime rates in the world and having a culture that rigidly enforces rules, fighters have a tendency for getting themselves into trouble. Minoru Philip Kimura, a 31-year-old Brazilian kickboxer, Rizin fighter, and notorious steroid cheat, was arrested in Japan for possession of marijuana, which, regardless of whether you personally think is alright or not, is still illegal in Japan. And in 2017, Yuki Yamamoto, a professional MMA fighter who fought in Shuto and who was a former opponent of Shinya Aoki, assaulted his girlfriend's co-worker for letting her get drunk. Yamamoto's victim was rendered unconscious, taken to a hospital, and pronounced deceased by the next day. Now, I'm by no means saying that this is a problem among all fighters. Most fighters are upstanding, law-abiding people. However, what I am saying is that the number of fighters who are criminals seems to be disproportionately high, and that this seems to be true regardless of culture. UFC fighters like Lee Murray, War Machine, and Ahmad Hassanzada are from the UK, the US, and Afghanistan respectively. But all three of them have committed shocking offenses, with War Machine and Ahmad's crimes being so egregious that I can't say them here. So in this video, which I'm sure you're watching while eating or listening to in the background while playing a game, I'll be going through a number of reasons which may help to explain why so many fighters tend to end up on the wrong side of the law. And yes, the simple explanation to all of this is the kind of guys who like to fight also tend to get into trouble. But if you're a previous viewer of mine, you'd know that this channel is all about over-analyzing topics and supporting every point with sources and arguments. Now, with that out of the way, let me explain the outline of this video. The timestamps are all in the video description too, by the way. First, we will be going through some of the common explanations for the high rate of criminality among fighters, like poverty and elevated testosterone levels. After that, I'll talk about personality types which are likely to engage in risk-taking behaviors, a topic which I discussed in my video, How the UFC Pushes Degeneracy, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with since it's currently the most viewed video on this channel. Here, I'll be discussing how fighters seem to engage in more risk-taking behavior than the average person, and how this is directly related to criminal behavior. After that, I'll go through some of the more under-discussed factors, namely the role that things like brain trauma and alcohol abuse play in increasing criminality. Also, as we go through these different reasons, what you'll notice is that in many cases, a fighter exhibiting one factor that predisposes him to criminal behavior also makes it more likely for him to show other factors. So for example, if you have an impulsive personality, you're also more likely to abuse alcohol, which in turn impairs your judgment, and then that makes it more likely for you to commit a crime. John Jones. Also, for the purpose of keeping this video from becoming ridiculously long, I won't be going into the connections between combat sports and organized crime. I'll definitely be making a video on that in the future, as the connection between organized crime and combat sports seems to be a phenomenon which exists across cultures. But in this video, I'll be covering regular, unorganized crime. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into why so many fighters are criminals. So when it comes to fighters, it is absolutely true that a lot of them start out in impoverished circumstances. Francis Ngannou was shoveling sand for pennies a day. Basically every Brazilian fighter not named Paulo Costa or Renato Moicano grew up in poverty. And while its economy has been growing at an increasing rate in recent years, the Republic of Dagestan is still one of the poorest regions of Russia. Even in developed countries, fighters tend to come from working-class backgrounds. Volkanovski was a concreter prior to becoming a full-time fighter. Conor McGregor was apprenticing as a plumber for a while, and he was also taking welfare checks right up until he was signed to the UFC. And many fighters from the developed world also come from not just working-class backgrounds, but backgrounds of utter destitution. Aljamain Sterling grew up as one of 19 siblings, and was surrounded by gang violence on a daily basis, with one of his brothers being heavily involved in a gang. It is somewhat uncommon to see a fighter come from a middle-class background, and seeing a fighter come from an upper-class background is almost unheard of. The only fighter I can think of who hails from extreme wealth is Arman Tsarukyan, and he really is the exception that proves the rule. Throughout most of modern history, combat sports have been a pathway for those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to accrue great wealth and status. And while most fighters do not even make enough to support their day-to-day expenses, there are a few rare outliers like Mike Tyson, Manny Pacquiao, and now Conor McGregor who have been able to obtain generational fortunes. Now, the relationship between poverty and crime is a very complex one, and it's been covered so much by social scientists that I could spend this entire video going through 100 different theories and still have 100 more left to talk about. But there are a couple interesting ideas that I would like to share with you. First, the demographic which is most likely to commit crimes are young men in their late teens to early 20s of lower socioeconomic status, which also happens to be the demographic which is most likely to start training in combat sports. One of the most common explanations for why young men from the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder tend to commit crimes is because it is a way for them to gain status, especially if they are part of a gang. Being seen as a tough guy who is capable of violence gives a young man social prestige in his community, which in turn drives men to engage in said violence. And this is likely why notable UFC fighters like Leon Edwards and Tyron Woodley were involved in street fights and gang activity when they were younger. And this is where we can talk about the positive impact that combat sports has had on these men's lives, because through combat sports, these men were able to build careers and contribute to society. But it also means that the sport is going to be filled with men who grew up in that sort of rough environment and were instilled with those values. Take, for example, Nate Diaz, another fighter who grew up street fighting, and who continues to get into street brawls just about every year. Tendencies and values that are instilled as a child are difficult to change as an adult, which is likely part of the reason why so many fighters who grew up in poverty end up committing crimes like aggravated assault and battery even after becoming successful. However, as we all know, many fighters who come from dire poverty have never committed a crime, while those who have had decent upbringings have also been some of the UFC's worst offenders. Alex Bahia was a child alcoholic who worked an tire shop in the favelas, but doesn't have a single blemish on his criminal record. Demetrius Johnson was raised by a deaf single mother, but has never been suspected of violating the law. And on the other hand, the most high-profile criminal in UFC history, John Jones, was the son of a pastor who grew up in a middle-class household with a fully intact family. Many fighters hailing from lower socioeconomic backgrounds does certainly contribute to the higher number of criminals among their ranks, but it is by no means a complete explanation. Anyways, another factor that contributes to why fighters are more likely to commit violent crimes, and is also widely known by the general public, is the influence of testosterone. Testosterone, the male sex hormone, has been consistently linked to higher levels of aggression and, as a consequence, higher levels of criminality. A 2022 study by Armstrong et al. States that there's a direct positive association between testosterone and violent criminal behavior, as well as income-generating crimes. And in the case of income-generating crimes, which are crimes like theft, pickpocketing, and selling drugs, having higher test levels and low cortisol, which is the human stress hormone, tends to result in the most criminal behavior. This direct positive association is indicative of increased testosterone being causally linked to criminal behavior. And, just as a side note that further shows how combat sports is one of the best outlets for young men, a 2017 study showed that when people participate in striking combat sports, they have a moderate increase in cortisol levels. And since low cortisol combined with high testosterone is associated with the highest levels of criminality, this may show that combat sports may suppress criminal tendencies at the hormonal level. And although this increase in cortisol is temporary, fighters like Sean Strickland have said that training constantly helps keep them from engaging in criminal behavior. But anyways, if you're a fighter, there's no way that you're going to have low T levels. Fighters are going to have naturally high testosterone levels, or, like Vitor Belfort and John Jones, they're going to be injecting testosterone, or a synthetic PED like Turinabol that has similar effects. I mean, there's a reason why all these fighters are going to Turkey to get hair transplants done, or just taking the L and shaving everything off. They have high levels of androgens in their endocrine systems, and that also happens to make them more prone to criminal behaviors. Now that we've gone through all of the commonly given reasons I see for the high rate of criminality among fighters, I'll be moving on to an idea that I've discussed at length before, and that is how many fighters have personalities which are prone to risk-taking behaviors. Now, since some of you may have just gotten done watching my video on degeneracy in the UFC, you may know what risk-taking behaviors are. But, just as a refresher, according to a chapter on the subject in the 2020 book, Risky Decision-Making in Psychological Disorders by Melissa Bulau, risk-taking behaviors are behaviors which can possibly lead to danger, harm, or loss, and where decisions are made due to the perceived benefits being greater than the costs. Risk-taking behaviors exist in every area of human life. An example of recreational risk-taking behavior would be doing something like dancing on the side of a cliff for the fun of it and almost falling off. An example of a financial risk-taking behavior would be investing in the meme coin of an immunocompromised maniac who is in the inner circle of a modern-day dictator. And quoting straight from the chapter here, risk-taking is a multifaceted construct as it is influenced by several different factors such as the decision-making abilities of the individual, the type of situation, and the attention that the individual pays to clues about the different consequences of their decisions. Risk-taking is a type of decision-making that can be adaptive or maladaptive. When risk-taking is maladaptive, it is at its core a poor decision that is made despite the dangers of the risk outweighing its benefits. Risk-taking is influenced by individuals' abilities to process feedback about previous experience and consider information about situational outcomes when making decisions. Now, as is obvious to anybody with two eyes, or in the case of Michael Bisping, one eye, stepping into the ring or the cage is a huge risk. Every fighter, from the all-time greats to the guys on their prelims of Apex Fight Nights to the prospects on the regional scene that haven't even made it to the UFC yet, these guys are all risking everything they have in every fight. And, as Sean Strickland is about to say here, more often than not, that risk doesn't pay off.
The only issue with martial arts, though, dude, and this is what I tell people, and if you got a kid who's trains, and let's just say you're training, what I'll tell you, dude, and this is factual, and you guys should always understand this. I tell everybody that comes in the gym. I had one guy, little Billy Bob's a pancration champion. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And I tell him this: when I was a kid, I was like 14, training at a gym, and there was a guy named Zach Light. I don't know, an old school UFC.
I remember that guy.
But he was like, I'm like 14 years old. This guy's like a hero to me. I'm watching him teach cardio kickboxing. I'm watching him teach like jiu-jitsu, and like he'll spar fuck me up. I'm like, oh man, this guy's fucking cool. He's the life that I want. And then hindsight, this man probably hates life. He's probably half brain dead. And he's teaching cardio kickboxing classes for $20 a class. So it's like whenever you look at UFC fighters and you want to be this, understand. Most of us end up poor, broke, and regretting our life choices. Like, it's easier ways to make money, guys.
Becoming a professional fighter is probably the riskiest career path there is in the modern world. And that's not just because of the damage fighters take in the actual fights. At every training session, a fighter could suffer a career-ending injury. Many fighters have been hospitalized or even died from their weight cuts. And of course, the countless blows that fighters receive leave them at risk of developing CTE in their later years. And that's just the physical side of things. At any time, your opponent could pull out, leaving you without a fight and without a paycheck. If you're on the undercard, the main event falling apart could lead to the whole card getting cancelled, as was the case with UFC 151 when John Jones refused to fight Chael Sonnen on short notice. And, as was the case with the GFL, the whole promotion you may have been planning to fight for might just fall apart without putting on a single event. And even if a fighter becomes a champion in a major organization, the likelihood that he'll make generational wealth is slim to none. Robbie Lawler and Glover Teixeira, two champions who fought in wars that are considered to be the greatest fights of all time, are still working as coaches. And since this video is going to be released right around his retirement fight, I'm going to say this. Anthony Smith had an incredibly successful career by MMA standards. He had a lot of fights in the UFC, got a title shot, a job on the commentary desk, and probably got paid six figures for most of his fights. Most fighters go 1-3 or 2-2 and get cut from the UFC. They then have to go back to the regional scene and get brain damage in fights nobody watches for $2,000 at the most while working side jobs. However, many young men continue to pursue MMA because of the potential, however slim it is, of becoming a superstar that defines an era of the sport. But, as Sean said, you're likely much better off pursuing a regular career in something like the trades if you come from a lower socioeconomic background. It's much more stable, and you're likely to earn much more doing that than fighting for $10K to show and $10K to win at the UFC Apex. However, since many fighters are those who are willing to risk everything, they are also more prone to engaging in criminal behavior. Committing crimes is a maladaptive risk-taking behavior because the probability that an individual benefits from committing a crime is relatively slim, while the probability that an individual suffers from committing a crime is relatively large. Furthermore, the benefit of committing a crime is often quite minor, while the consequences could be disastrous. A 2010 study by Damian Mandel found that among college undergraduates, intentions to engage in criminal activities like shoplifting, forgery, and buying illegal drugs were best predicted by the perceived value of the benefits that may be obtained, irrespective of the probabilities or the drawbacks that may also be incurred. The same applied when the researchers examined whether people would drink and drive, which is a crime that many UFC fighters have been caught for. Here are just some of the UFC fighters who have been arrested for a DUI. Israel Adesanya, Tony Ferguson, Tito Ortiz, Mike Perry, BJ Penn, Nick Diaz, Cedric Dumas, Geoff Neal, Jason Miller, and of course, the one, the only Jon Jones. Now, when you drive drunk, there's a tiny little potential benefit, which is that you get to where you want to go. But the potential consequences of driving drunk are massive. You can total your car. You could run somebody over. You can get your license permanently suspended. There are all sorts of downsides to driving drunk, but all of these fighters still did it. The same applies to almost every other crime that famous UFC fighters have committed. What benefit is there for Conor McGregor to throw that chair at the fighter bus? What benefit is there for Jon Jones to beat his wife bloody? What benefit is there for Jorge Masvidal to assault Colby Covington at a steakhouse when he had 25 minutes to do it in the octagon and literally got paid to do it? What fighters who commit crimes are likely doing is overestimating the benefits of their actions and severely underestimating the consequences. Now, of course, part of becoming a successful fighter requires that kind of mindset, at least to a certain extent. If you're hesitant in the octagon, and you don't know whether to slip left or slip right, you're probably going to get chinned. And when it comes to the mentality you need to become a champion in any combat sport, it has to be one of near delusional self-belief. But when men with personalities that are prone to this kind of risk-taking behavior take risks outside of the ring or the octagon, well, that's how we get the high rate of criminality among fighters. Now, moving on to another less discussed reason why fighters seem to be more prone to committing crime, we need to discuss how damage to the brain affects human behavior. I'm sure that almost everybody who is watching this video is familiar with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, often shortened to CTE. CTE is a neurological condition caused by a lifetime of physical trauma to the brain, and is commonly diagnosed in athletes involved in contact sports like American football, hockey, boxing, and MMA. It is commonly known in the wider combat sports community that CTE affects memory, speech, and cognitive ability. But what often goes under-discussed is how CTE also leads to social instability, impaired judgment, and impulsive behavior. A number of fighters who committed crimes also showed serious signs of CTE. An example of this is BJ Penn, who has been charged with numerous criminal offenses. In addition to the DUI charge I mentioned earlier, BJ has gotten into multiple street fights and had a restraining order issued against him in 2019 by the mother of his children due to years of physical and sexual abuse. Recently, BJ Penn has posted videos to social media where he states that he believes that his mother has been murdered by the government and replaced by a clone. This is paranoid thinking, a sign of CTE. Another example that demonstrates the link between CTE and criminality is Tito Ortiz. Tito Ortiz, who is basically the poster child of CTE in MMA, also has a DUI conviction and was charged with battery in 2016 when he tried to take a woman's cell phone outside of a club. And even for those fighters who aren't old enough to have developed CTE yet, simply receiving traumatic brain injuries can have detrimental effects on cognition. This goes without saying, but if you get hit in the head a lot, your IQ is going to go down. A study published in the Journal of Neurotrauma reported that having 3 or more concussions was linked with long-term cognitive problems like attention deficiency, loss of working memory, and slower processing speed. Lower IQ has been consistently associated with higher rates of crime. As was shown in a 2015 paper by Schwartz et al., intelligence has been shown as one of the best predictors of crime, with the likelihood of an individual to offend increasing as their IQ decreased in a mostly linear way. So yes, the next time some Jon Jones glazer talks about how intelligent he is, send him this study along with his rap sheet. But Jones hate aside, it's quite ironic and tragic that sports which help young men in dire circumstances avoid criminal lifestyles also damages them in a way that may make them more likely to offend. However, it is not just the head trauma that fighters experience which may be contributing to their cognitive impairment. Many fighters have reported or have been seen having issues with alcohol consumption. Alexander Volkanovski admitted to drinking every day for 3 to 4 weeks prior to his rematch with Islam Makhachev. Alex Mejia was a former alcoholic. There have been speculations for a while that Conor McGregor has been struggling with alcohol abuse. And part of what made Diego Sanchez susceptible to manipulation by Joshua Fabia was his past with substance abuse. And if you look into the stories of many lesser-known UFC fighters, like Court McGee and Jared Gordon, you'll see that they had substance abuse issues as well. Now, alcohol obviously impairs your brain. I mean, that's what you use it for. But it's how fighters tend to use it that I think is somewhat problematic. So, if you've just received a bunch of blows to the head, do you think it would be a wise idea to consume a substance which impairs your cognitive ability? I think most of you would answer, hell no. But it's very common for fighters to consume significant quantities of alcohol after their fights, whether it be through Tai Tuivasa drinking out of a shoe, or Dricus downing a beer in one gulp after eating 100 jabs to the face from Strickland. Drinking while concussed keeps the brain from healing itself, impairs sleep quality, and increases the risk of concussion-related depression. Now, I'm pretty certain they avoid drinking after getting KO'd, but you don't have to have gone out cold or gotten dropped to have a concussion. Another potentially problematic part of alcohol abuse is the permanent damage that it can do to your brain. And here I'm talking about Wernicke's encephalopathy. As you can tell from the term encephalopathy, this is a neurodegenerative disorder, like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which you're all familiar with. Wernicke's encephalopathy is caused by a vitamin B1 deficiency due to excess alcohol consumption. Wernicke's encephalopathy is often diagnosed together with Korsakoff syndrome, another alcoholism-related disorder, as Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Now, I'm not saying that any prominent fighters are currently suffering from this disorder. There's no way to tell until they're diagnosed. But when researchers examined the brain of a retired world champion boxer in 2009, they said that, in addition to the blows he had taken to the head, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome may have also played a role in his cognitive decline. And, according to a 2024 study, 35.6% of patients diagnosed with Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome had committed crimes in the past 4 years, with most of those being property and traffic crimes, but also there were some violent ones. So, what I'll say is, I would not be surprised if fighters, many of whom seem to have substance abuse issues, end up suffering from both chronic traumatic encephalopathy and Wernicke's encephalopathy. And, when those are combined, the neurodegenerative effects would likely be catastrophic. Now, as we near the end of this video, I'd like to very briefly discuss how we may be able to keep fighters from spiraling down this path to criminal behavior. First of all, I think it would be a good idea for coaches and managers to discourage their fighters from consuming alcohol. Although I haven't gone through every single fighter's criminal record in minute detail, I think it's safe to assume that a large portion of the crimes that fighters have committed have been under the influence. Now, of course, you can't control what another grown man puts in his body. But when you let a man who is prone to risk-taking behaviors have a few drinks and he commits a crime, that's kind of like letting MMA Joey into your pantry and then wondering why every food that isn't a vegetable has vanished. A second idea would be to try and encourage more retired fighters to compete in grappling. Idle hands are the devil's plaything. Grappling matches would be a good way to keep former fighters occupied and competing while minimizing head trauma. But of course, even if these suggestions were to be implemented, the effect would likely be quite minimal. The relationship between combat sports and crime is very deep, and it is highly unlikely that we will ever see a world where men who are paid to beat each other bloody all become paragons of moral virtue. But in the end, these sports do indeed help to save those who are most at risk of living a violent and meaningless life, and for that, they're still worth having in this world. And finally, at the end of this video, I'd like to express my sincere admiration for fighters like Alexander Volkanovski, Islam Makhachev, Max Holloway, Jose Aldo, Demetrius Johnson, George St. Pierre, Alex Bahia, Tom Aspinall, Charles Oliveira, and others who are not just phenomenal, exciting warriors, but are upright men who are worth looking up to as role models. Anyways, that's the end of the video. You should subscribe and like. Also, follow me on X and join my Discord server through the link in the video description. And make sure to click off now if you don't want to listen to any of the end roll YouTube ads. Goodbye.